It was a cold February morning when I received the call. With a trembling voice, my sister informed me that they had found our mother lifeless in her home. The medical examiner determined that the cause of death was a heart attack. Since she started getting involved with strange people and performing bizarre rituals at home, I hadn't seen her in years. Our relationship had completely deteriorated, and I preferred to stay away to protect my children from that dark atmosphere. Even so, the news of our mother's death hit me like a punch. Despite all our differences and conflicts, she was our mother. Sadness mingled with an unsettling sense of fear as I packed my bags to travel to the city where she lived. My wife tried to comfort me, but she knew that this encounter would be full of painful memories and unresolved resentments. Upon arriving at the funeral home, I felt a chill run down my spine. A depressive gloom enveloped the atmosphere, with a slight mist covering the ground. My sister was there, filling out the necessary forms for the wake. We hugged, sharing a heavy silence. The pain of the loss was present, but there was something more, a feeling that we were about to face something dark and inexplicable. The funeral home seemed like a place out of a horror movie. The dim lighting and the cold air made everything feel surreal. My sister Jessica and I exchanged glances filled with both sorrow and apprehension. We knew that handling the funeral arrangements would be emotionally taxing, but neither of us was prepared for the eerie feeling that lingered in the air. Even as we concluded the paperwork, a sense of surveillance lingered in the air. Despite the rational part of my mind trying to dismiss these thoughts, I couldn't ignore the overwhelming dread that had taken hold of me. After organizing the documents, Jessica needed to return home, leaving me alone in the funeral home. While filling out the papers, the silence became oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of aged wood. I was focused on the task when I clearly heard my mother's voice calling me by name. "John, I'm here." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained to listen, thinking it might have been my imagination, but again I heard my mother's voice. "John, come." I stood up and began walking down a long hallway from where the voice originated. The hallway was narrow, with several open doors on either side, showing rooms filled with coffins. The voice grew louder, and I felt an uncontrollable urge to follow it. Each step I took made the air around me feel heavier. I reached the end of the hallway, where a door had a sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." Without thinking, I opened the door, turned on my phone's flashlight, and there I saw her. My mother was on a stretcher, her eyes wide open, staring at me. Fear overwhelmed me, and I slowly backed away, wishing to escape that dark and terrifying room. The sight of her lifeless body with such a piercing gaze was more than I could handle. As I backed away, I stumbled over a loose floorboard, nearly losing my balance. The sound of my own heartbeat was deafening in the otherwise silent corridor. I wanted to scream and call for help, but my voice caught in my throat. Desperation set in as I fumbled with the door handle, finally managing to wrench it open. The hallway seemed longer than before, with each step echoing ominously around me. Something unseen, something malevolent, seemed to be pursuing me, refusing to let me leave. I backed down the hallway trying to stay calm, but fear dominated me. My mother, or whatever she was, kept staring at me. My heart raced, and a cold sweat ran down my back. I could barely breathe, but I managed to get out of the room and run to the reception. When I reached the reception, I encountered the funeral home employee. She looked at me with concern and asked if I was okay. I couldn't say a word. I just nodded, trying to catch my breath. I couldn't tell her what I had seen. I knew she would think I was crazy. I simply said I felt bad about my mother's death, and that I had finished filling out all the necessary forms. I left the funeral home almost running, then went back home. My wife greeted me with a hug, worried about my state. I didn't tell her anything about what had happened, not even to my children. I knew it would be hard to believe, and I didn't want to scare them. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of my mother with her eyes open haunted me. I felt that something terrible was about to happen. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, hoping it was just a figment of my imagination, but deep down, I knew it was real. As the night wore on, the fear grew more intense. Every creak of the house and the rustle of the wind outside made my heart race. My wife tried to comfort me, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She didn't understand what I was going through, and I didn't have the words to explain it. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, wondering if I would ever find peace again. The darkness seemed to close in around me, bringing with it memories I had tried so hard to forget. I knew that something, or someone, was not ready to let go as my mother's face and those lifeless eyes etched themselves in my mind. The next day, we arrived at the funeral home very early. My mother was already in the coffin, preparing for the wake. No one else had arrived yet. It was just my wife, my children, and me. While paying for the funeral services, I left my children in the room with their grandmother. Everything seemed calm, but a sense of unease didn't leave me. Suddenly, I saw my eldest son outside talking on his cell phone. I went out and asked him why he had left his sister alone. He replied that he was talking to his girlfriend, and that Emily, my 6-year-old daughter, was not in any danger. I quickly entered the room and saw Emily leaning on the coffin, talking and laughing. I approached her and told her to come with me. She looked at me and said, "Grandma doesn't want me to leave. We are talking." I was stunned. I approached the coffin and saw my mother's body with her eyes closed. I took Emily by the arm and led her out of the room. She struggled, saying her grandmother wanted to keep talking to her. I sternly reminded her that her grandmother had passed away and urged her to cease her deceit. Emily ran off crying to where her mother was. After my wife calmed her down, I found myself alone, praying for my mother's soul, hoping she would find peace and cease tormenting us. The rest of the day was filled with an eerie silence. Every now and then, I caught Emily glancing towards the coffin with a look of confusion and sadness. It broke my heart to see her like that, but I couldn't shake off the fear that something unnatural was happening. My wife tried to reassure me, saying that Emily was just processing her grief in her own way, but I knew better. I had heard my mother's voice and felt her presence. The past was coming back to haunt us, and I had to find a way to end it. While I prayed, the candles around my mother's coffin suddenly went out. There was no draft in the room, making the situation even stranger and more terrifying. Then suddenly, the light went out completely, plunging us into total darkness. Despite my efforts to remain calm, the sense of surveillance caused me to tremble. I remembered my daughter's words, and a shiver ran through my body. "Who is there?" I shouted, hoping for a response. Silence was my only answer. I could hear my own rapid and labored breathing. I decided to look for my phone to use the flashlight, but I realized I had left it charging at the reception. I felt something touch my shoulder and froze in fear. "Is it really her?" flooded my mind. "What does she want from us?" With my heart racing, I slowly turned my head toward where I had felt the touch. There was my mother's body, standing next to the coffin. Her eyes were open, and a vacant expression covered her face. "John, give me back what is mine," she said in a voice that seemed to come from another world. My mind went blank. I didn't know how to respond or what to do. All I could think about was protecting my daughter and getting out of that cursed place. With superhuman effort, I screamed with all my strength, "Help! Someone, please help me!" I quickly backed away, tripping over a chair and falling to the ground. At that moment, a funeral home employee ran in and turned on the lights. My mother's body was back in the coffin, as if nothing had happened. I remained on the ground, trembling, trying to understand what had occurred. The next day, the funeral home was filled with family and friends. Everyone came to say goodbye to my mother and pay their respects. However, the feeling of unease didn't leave me. My daughter Emily stayed close to me, but she kept murmuring things about her grandmother, which made me increasingly nervous. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened the night before. During the wake, I approached the reception to talk to the employee I had seen the previous day. I asked if she had noticed anything strange, but she shook her head, saying everything had been quiet. I thanked her for her response, although I felt frustrated at not finding any logical explanation. I returned to the room, determined to keep my family close and safe. The ceremony continued without further incidents, but the atmosphere was filled with dense and heavy energy. I felt that something or someone was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. I tried to stay strong for my children and my wife, but I couldn't get the image of my mother standing next to her own coffin out of my head. I knew that somehow this was not over. Friends and family began to arrive in greater numbers. Everyone offered their condolences and shared memories of my mother, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I decided to step outside for a moment to get some fresh air, leaving my wife in charge of the children. As I walked down the hallway, I felt an inexplicable cold, as if the temperature had suddenly dropped. I looked around and saw no one, but the air felt heavy. Suddenly, I felt a cold touch on my back, as if a spectral hand were brushing against me. I turned sharply, but no one was there. "John, you cannot escape me," whispered a voice I instantly recognized as my mother's. Panic seized me again. I dashed back to the room where the wake was taking place and witnessed my sister engaging in conversation with some relatives. I pulled her aside and told her what I had felt. She looked at me with concern but also a shadow of doubt. "John, you are very stressed. You need to rest," she said, trying to calm me. But I knew what I had experienced was real, and the fear continued to haunt me. At the end of the day, when all the visitors had left, my sister and I stayed to make the final arrangements. We went to the room where our mother's coffin was to say our last words before closing it. When we opened the coffin lid, we both recoiled in horror. Our mother's body was completely charred and unrecognizable. My sister started crying uncontrollably while I tried to process what I was seeing. How could this have happened? What kind of evil force was playing with us? We called the funeral director, who seemed as surprised as we were. He ordered an immediate investigation, but I knew there was something beyond human understanding at play. That night, I returned home with a sense of despair and fear. I couldn't get the image of my mother's charred body out of my head. I knew I had to protect my family at all costs. As I lay down, I couldn't stop thinking about the words my mother had whispered. "You cannot escape me." I knew the horror was not yet over. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and confusion. The investigation into my mother's charred body did not yield clear answers. The forensic experts couldn't explain how it had happened, and the funeral home was under scrutiny. My sister and I clung to the idea that there was something supernatural behind all this, but we had no concrete proof. One night, while reviewing some of my mother's documents, I found an old diary. The pages were filled with notes about the rituals and dark practices she had performed. As I read, a sense of horror took hold of me. My mother had made a pact with a malevolent entity, offering something in exchange for power and wealth. Trembling, I realized she had tried to offer my daughter as part of the pact. I immediately called my sister and told her what I had discovered. Together, we decided to seek help from a paranormal expert. We consulted a priest and a medium who confirmed our worst suspicions. Our mother's spirit was trapped and angry, and her bond with the malevolent entity was still strong. We had to act quickly to protect our family. With their guidance, we planned a ritual to free our mother's soul and break the bond with the entity. The preparation was intense and filled with tension. My wife and children stayed with relatives far from the house, while my sister and I remained to perform the ritual. The fear was palpable, but we were determined to end this terror. Dark energy charged the air on the night of the ritual, creating a heavy atmosphere. The priest began reciting prayers, while the medium drew protective symbols around us. Suddenly, the temperature dropped drastically, and a spectral figure appeared in the center of the room, our mother. Her face showed a mix of pain and rage. "Let me go," she pleaded with a voice that resonated in our souls. With hearts pounding, we continued the ritual. My mother's figure began to fade slowly, but not without letting out a blood-curdling scream that chilled our blood. Finally, the medium announced that the spirit had been freed and the bond had been broken. We fell to our knees, exhausted but relieved. We knew we had saved our family from a fate worse than death. After that day, peace returned to our lives. We made sure to burn the diary and any other objects related to our mother's rituals. Although the memory of those events will haunt us forever, we found comfort in knowing we had done the right thing. Our mother had finally found peace, and so had we. A sense of closure and relief replaced the fear that had gripped our lives. We took steps to protect our home and family from any further disturbances. My sister and I grew closer, bonded by the ordeal we had survived. As time passed, the nightmares faded, and we learned to live without the shadow of our mother's dark past looming over us. Finally, we could move forward with our lives, free from the haunting presence that had tormented us. As the days turned into weeks, the sense of dread that had plagued us began to dissipate. My wife and children gradually returned to their normal routines, and the atmosphere in our home lightened. We felt a profound sense of gratitude for the priest and medium who had helped us. The ritual had not only freed our mother's spirit, but also brought us closer as a family. We spent more time together, cherishing the moments of peace and normalcy that we had once taken for granted. My sister Jessica and I continued to reflect on the events that had transpired. We visited our mother's grave regularly, leaving flowers and saying prayers for her soul. The funeral home director kept in touch, ensuring that the investigation into the bizarre occurrences was thorough. We knew in our hearts that the supernatural had played a role, despite the lack of a logical explanation. We finally freed ourselves from the terror that had gripped us, putting our mother's troubled spirit to rest. Life slowly returned to normal, but we never forgot the lessons we had learned. We became more attuned to the spiritual world and more respectful of forces beyond our understanding. Our family grew stronger, united by the trials we had faced. In the end, we found solace in the knowledge that our actions had brought peace to our mother's spirit and safety to our own lives. The nightmare was over, and we could finally embrace the future with hope and serenity. I really hope you liked this scary tale. I would be interested in hearing your opinions or experiences if you have any similar ones. Please remember to hit the bell symbol, like the video, and subscribe to the channel if you find it entertaining, so you don't miss any more stories.
My name is Andrew, and I am an embalmer at a funeral home. My job is to prepare the deceased so their families can have a proper farewell. We disinfect them, embalm them, and make them presentable. This job is not for everyone. It requires strong psychological preparation. Despite my years of experience, there are still moments that are difficult, especially when the bodies have tragic stories behind them. A month ago, a medical student arrived as an intern. He became my assistant, which made my job a little easier and less lonely. His name was Thomas, and he was an enthusiastic young man eager to learn. Although he was nervous at first, he quickly adapted to the routine. Together, we formed a good team, and the long nights of work became more bearable for his company. One night, we were preparing the body of an elderly man who had died of a heart attack. It was a normal and quiet night until another body arrived from the morgue. It was the body of a motorcyclist who had died in an accident and was in very bad condition. We knew that this one would take all night, so we hurried to finish with the elderly man. We were about to finish with the elderly man when we heard footsteps in the room upstairs where we had left the motorcyclist's body. It seemed strange because the funeral home was empty that night. There were no funerals scheduled, and all the employees arrived in the morning. The only body present was the motorcyclist, who had just arrived. "Thomas, did you hear that?" I inquired, seeing the worry on his face. "Yes, Andrew." "Could it be someone who got in?" he replied, trying to remain calm. I decided to investigate, leaving Thomas in the embalming room. With a flashlight in hand, I climbed the stairs and turned on the lights in the upstairs room. Everything was silent, and there were no signs of anyone. I went back downstairs thinking it might have been my imagination. However, when I reached the last step, I saw something that chilled my blood. A teddy bear that wasn't there before. "How did this get here?" I asked aloud. I was aware that the teddy bear had not been present when we began our task. It must belong to a child who attended a previous funeral, I thought, but the feeling that something was wrong did not leave me. While trying to rationalize the appearance of the teddy bear, I decided to continue with my work. However, the unease didn't leave me. I returned to the embalming room and found Thomas checking the tools. "Everything seems in order down here, but something doesn't add up," I said, trying to sound calm. Thomas nodded, sharing my concern. Suddenly, a barely audible murmur filled the room. It was as if someone was whispering from afar. "Did you hear that?" Thomas inquired with wide eyes. "Yes, I heard it," I replied, feeling a shiver run down my spine. We continued working, trying to ignore the sound, but the murmur became louder and clearer. "Give it to her. Give it to her." The voice seemed to come from the motorcyclist's body. To my horror, as I slowly turned my head towards the corpse, I noticed that the motorcyclist's head had turned towards where we had left the teddy bear. His eyes, which should have been closed, were open, staring at the toy. My heart raced, and fear paralyzed me. "Thomas, look at this," I exclaimed, pointing to the body. Thomas stepped back, his face pale. "This is not possible. Not possible," he repeated, his voice trembling. Fear turned into panic. The motorcyclist's head not only turned, but its eyes appeared to track our movements. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Thomas nodded, and we both started backing towards the door. But just before we could reach it, the room's lights began to flicker violently. The murmur turned into a terrifying scream that echoed throughout the funeral home. "Give it to her!" The intensity of the sound was unbearable, as if thousands of voices were screaming in unison. "Run, Thomas, run!" I yelled, pushing him towards the exit. As we ran down the hallway, we heard heavy footsteps behind us, as if someone was chasing us. We arrived at the reception, gasping for air and with our hearts in our throats. I closed the door behind us and attempted to block it with a chair. "What the hell was that?" Thomas asked, his face still pale with fear. "I don't know, but we can't stay here," I replied, feeling panic overtaking me. Suddenly the screams stopped, and a deathly silence filled the funeral home. "We have to go back and confront it." "We can't leave it like this," I said, trying to muster the courage. Thomas slowly nodded, knowing I was right. With the flashlight in hand, we opened the door and ventured back into the darkness of the funeral home, prepared to face whatever was waiting for us. We returned to the embalming room with our hearts racing. The lights continued to flicker, casting dancing shadows that heightened our sense of dread. Upon entering, the murmur returned, more insistent and chilling than before. "Give it to her! Give it to her!" the voice repeated, like a sinister chant. The motorcyclist's body still lay on the table, but something had changed. His limbs twisted at impossible angles, and his eyes remained open, fixated on the teddy bear. "Oh my God!" Thomas exclaimed, stepping back in horror. I felt a mix of repulsion and fear, but I knew we had to do something. "We have to finish what we started," I said, trying to instill courage in both of us. We approached the corpse slowly. Each step felt like an eternity. Suddenly, the motorcyclist's head snapped towards us, and from his mouth came a cold whisper. "Give it to my daughter." The panic overwhelmed me. "What does he want?" Thomas shouted, his voice breaking with fear. "I don't know, but we have to find out before it's too late," I replied, feeling the growing desperation. I remembered the teddy bear I had found on the stairs. I thought, it must have something to do with the bear. With trembling hands, I picked up the bear and brought it closer to the motorcyclist's body. "Is this what you want?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Instantly, the murmur ceased, and the room fell into a deathly silence. But the calm didn't last long. The motorcyclist's body began to convulse violently, as if something inside him was trying to escape. "Andrew, we need to get out of here!" Thomas shouted, panic evident in his voice. But before we could move, the corpse sat up abruptly and reached out a hand towards the teddy bear. "Give it to my daughter," he whispered with a guttural and distorted voice. The horror of the situation paralyzed us. The corpse's skin was tearing, revealing decomposing muscles and bones. The smell was unbearable. "We have to do it," I said. I was fighting the nausea. "We must find his daughter and give her the bear." With a mix of desperation and determination, we took the bear and ran out of the funeral home, determined to fulfill the dead man's last wish. We ran through the dark hallways of the funeral home, clutching the teddy bear as if it were our only hope. Each step echoed in the silence, and we felt something following us closely, a shadowy presence we couldn't see but knew was there. "Quick, this way," I said, pointing to the stairs leading to the upper floor. Thomas nodded, his breath heavy with fear and exertion. As we climbed, the shadows seemed to come to life, moving unnaturally. I felt a chill on the back of my neck, like an invisible hand brushing against me. "Don't look back," I yelled, trying to keep us focused on escaping. But Thomas, driven by terror, turned his head and let out a piercing scream. "Something's behind us," he shouted, his eyes wide with fear. We couldn't afford to stop. I pulled Thomas along, and we kept climbing, hearing the heavy footsteps and the constant murmur, "Give it to her, give it to her." Finally, we reached the top of the stairs and found ourselves in front of a closed door. "Quick, open the door!" I exclaimed, panic enveloping us. Thomas, with trembling hands, managed to turn the handle, and we stepped inside the room, closing the door behind us. But the feeling of safety was short-lived, as the shadow continued to loom just on the other side. Inside the room, we tried to catch our breath and think about our next move. "We need to find the motorcyclist's daughter and give her the bear," I said, trying to sound calm despite the terror I felt. Thomas nodded, still shaking. "But how? We don't know who she is or where to find her," he replied, desperation in his voice. Suddenly, the teddy bear began to move on its own, as if guided by an invisible force. "What the hell?" I whispered, watching as the toy moved to a corner of the room. We followed it, intrigued and frightened, until we saw it stop in front of an old desk. "There must be something here," I said, searching through the drawers. Finally, I found a notebook with names and addresses. "She must be here," Thomas murmured, flipping through the pages. Finally, he found an entry that matched. Sarah Thompson. It was the motorcyclist's daughter. "We have to go to this address," he exclaimed, urgency in his voice. With the bear in hand and the address noted, we left the room, determined to complete the final delivery and end the nightmare. As we headed for the exit, the shadow followed us closely, as if it knew we were about to complete the mission. I felt a mix of fear and determination. "Come on, Thomas. We're almost there," I said, trying to boost his morale. With quick and determined steps, we left the funeral home behind and headed to Sarah's house, hoping this final delivery would bring the peace we so desperately sought. When we arrived at the address we had found in the notebook, we knocked on the door urgently. A young woman with eyes full of sadness and surprise answered. "Can I help you?" she asked, looking at the teddy bear in my hands. "Are you Sarah Thompson?" I asked, trying to maintain composure. "Yes, I am." "What's going on?" she replied, visibly confused. "We've got something for you." "It belonged to your father," I said, handing her the teddy bear. Sarah took it with trembling hands, her eyes filling with tears. "This was his gift to me, the day he died," she whispered, hugging the bear tightly. Thomas and I exchanged looks, feeling that we had done the right thing. "I believe his spirit couldn't rest. He needed to make sure you received this," I explained. Sarah invited us in, grateful, but still confused by our presence. We sat in her living room and began to explain everything that had happened at the funeral home. As we talked, Sarah showed us an old home video her father had recorded the day before his accident. In the video, he held the same teddy bear and talked about how much he loved his daughter and how happy he was to give her that gift. As the video ended, the image briefly distorted, and we heard a whisper that left us cold. "Thank you." Sarah turned off the video, her eyes filled with tears and relief. "I think he can rest in peace now," she said with a sad but grateful smile. We felt a wave of relief, knowing we had fulfilled the deceased's last wish and helped his spirit find peace. Leaving Sarah's house, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. Thomas and I walked in silence, reflecting on the bizarre and terrifying events we had experienced. We knew we had done the right thing, and the motorcyclist's spirit had finally found rest. As we approached the funeral home, the atmosphere felt lighter, almost welcoming. The heavy presence that had haunted us seemed to have vanished. Inside, the funeral director, Richard, greeted us with a concerned look. "Is everything okay?" he asked. Thomas and I shared a glance before I replied, "Yeah, it's over now." We didn't go into details, but Richard seemed to understand. We spent the next few hours in relative quiet, finishing our work and talking about mundane things, trying to bring normalcy back into our routine. The following days were calm, almost eerily so. Thomas and I continued our work with a newfound sense of purpose. We no longer felt the oppressive weight of fear that had followed us. Instead, we felt a connection between our work and the spirits that passed through our care. We learned to respect the unknown and to approach our job with a sense of reverence and duty. In the end, we realized that helping those who had passed on could bring peace to the living as well. I really hope you liked this tale. I am thrilled to share these stories with you. Share this video with others so that we can keep growing and more stories can reach more people. Kindly provide your thoughts and experiences in the comments section. It will aid in my further development. If you like the video, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Many thanks, and I hope to see you again soon.